The first rays of sunlight had barely kissed the eastern horizon when Ayanna felt the cold earth pigment being drawn across his forehead in 3 deliberate lines. The training master's fingers moved with practiced precision, each stroke marking not just flesh but the transformation from village youth to warrior in training. Around him, 19 other young men sat in perfect silence as elder hands painted protection symbols across their faces with clay mixed from the sacred riverbank. What none of them knew as they prepared for this dawn ritual was that they were among the last generation who would learn to fight with nothing but wood, stone, and raw courage. Within a single lifetime, the raids, hunger, and hard winters would arrive from beyond the far line where sky meets water, bringing death that could strike from distances their wooden shields could never protect against. But on this morning, in the autumn, before the day's light fades and the night watch begins, courage still meant looking death in the eye from close enough to see its breath. If you've ever watched a young person face their deepest fear for the first time, you'll understand the weight of this moment. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage before the day's light fades and the night watch begins. The preparation ground stretched before them like a vast canvas painted by countless seasons of training. Ayanna's breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he adjusted the leather strapping that would hold his practice shield throughout the day. The wooden disc, carved from seasoned oak and reinforced with strips of rawhide, felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. The weight was not in the wood itself, but in the responsibility it represented. Every warrior who had carried such a shield before him had sworn the same oath, to stand between danger and those who could not stand for themselves. The morning mist clung to the grass as 20 young warriors began their breathwork, a practice so ancient that even their grandfathers' grandfathers had learned it from men whose names were now spoken only in the winter teaching circles. Ayanna filled his lungs slowly, feeling the cool air expand his chest, then released it in a controlled stream that seemed to carry away the last remnants of boyhood uncertainty. The breathing pattern was deceptively simple. 4 heartbeats in, hold for 4, 4 heartbeats out, hold for 4. This rhythm would become their lifeline during combat, the steady anchor that would keep their minds clear when blood thundered in their ears and death danced just beyond their shield's edge. Footwork came next, and with it the first real understanding of how different this warrior's path would be from anything they had imagined during their childhood games of war. The steps were not the wild charges they had enacted while playing at being great fighters, but careful, measured movements that prioritized balance over speed, positioning over power. Ayanna's bare feet found their rhythm on the dew-dampened earth, heel to toe, the shield held not as a weapon, but as an extension of his own body. The sun had climbed higher when the command came to form the shield wall, and suddenly the individual young men became something larger than themselves. Ayanna found his position third from the left, his shield overlapping with the warrior beside him, their wooden barriers creating an unbroken line that had protected their people for more generations than anyone could count. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced. The weight of his neighbor's trust pressing against his left shoulder, the knowledge that his own steadiness was all that stood between the warrior on his right and whatever imaginary enemy they faced. The shields themselves were masterworks of practical artistry, each one shaped by hands that understood the delicate balance between protection and mobility. The oak had been selected for its ability to absorb impact without splintering, its grain running in patterns that would turn aside stone-tipped spears and deflect the crushing blow of war clubs. The rawhide reinforcements were placed at precisely the points where enemy weapons would most likely strike. Ayanna ran his thumb along the smooth edge of his shield, understanding that he held not just a piece of carved wood, but a repository of accumulated wisdom. The shield was not merely a barrier, the training master explained, but a tool of communication, its position and angle conveying information to allies even in the chaos of battle. A shield tilted slightly left warned of flanking movement, while one raised higher than necessary signaled the approach of projectiles. Most importantly, The way a warrior held his shield revealed everything about his inner state. Confidence, fear, readiness, or uncertainty were all written in the subtle language of grip and stance. The morning's second phase brought them to the throwing grounds, where neat rows of wooden stakes marked distances that would test both accuracy and power. The Atlatl, that elegant fusion of leverage and timing that could send a dart with killing force across distances no thrown spear could match, lay waiting in each young warrior's hands like a promise of expanded capability. Ayana lifted his own throwing stick, feeling the careful balance of its construction, the way its weight seemed to flow naturally from his grip point to the cup that would cradle his dart. The master thrower, a man whose accuracy had become legend throughout the surrounding territories, demonstrated the shooting stance with movements so economical they seemed almost casual. Without seeming effort or strain, he sent dart after dart whistling through the morning air, each one finding its mark with a solid thunk that spoke of power as well as precision. The furthest target, placed at a distance that seemed impossible for any thrown weapon, sprouted 3 darts in a pattern so tight they could have been covered by a single hand. Yet it was not the accuracy that impressed the watching young warriors most, but the master's complete stillness between throws. When their own turn came, Ayana understood why the master had spoken of patience as the Atlatl warrior's greatest virtue. The weapon amplified not just the force of the throw, but every flaw in technique, every moment of doubt or overconfidence. His first cast went wide, the dart sailing past the nearest target to bury itself in the earth beyond with a frustrated whisper. The second flew higher than intended, arcing uselessly over its mark. It was only on his third attempt when he stopped trying to match the master's power and focused instead on the smooth rhythm of the throwing motion that his dart found wood with a satisfying crack. But mastering the Atlatl would take more than morning practice. The greatest throwers, Ayana realized, did not overcome the elements but partnered with them, using wind and weather as allies rather than obstacles. The afternoon would test whether any of them could begin to understand this deeper partnership between warrior and world. As the sun approached its highest point, the warriors transitioned to bow practice, and with it came the first real taste of the precision that would be demanded of them in actual combat. The bows themselves were things of subtle beauty, each one shaped from wood that had been carefully selected, seasoned, and worked into curves that stored and released energy with maximum efficiency. Ayana's bow fit his hand as if it had grown there, its grip worn smooth by countless practice sessions, its string made from sinew that sang with just the right tension when plucked. The targets for bow practice were not simple wooden stakes, but human-shaped forms crafted from bundled grass and hide, positioned at varying distances and angles to simulate the reality of combat. Some crouched behind partial cover, others stood in open ground, and a few were positioned to represent enemies advancing from unexpected directions. The archery master, a woman whose reputation for accuracy was matched only by her ability to shoot rapidly under pressure, demonstrated the shooting stance with movements so economical they seemed almost casual. What struck Ayana most powerfully as he drew his first arrow was the intimate nature of bow work. Unlike the Atlatl, which seemed to launch darts through pure mechanical advantage, the bow required a merger between archer and weapon that was almost spiritual in its completeness. The draw weight pressed against muscles in his back and shoulders, the string's tension transferred through his fingertips, the arrow's knock settled against his cheek like a familiar touch. When he released, the sensation was not of throwing something away, but of allowing stored energy to find its natural expression. The rhythm of practice archery created its own meditation, each shot building on the lessons of the previous one. Breathing became crucial. Too much air held in the lungs threw off balance, while breathing out during the draw weakened the shot. Ayana learned to time his breathing with his shooting sequence, drawing air as he raised the bow, holding it as he found his aim, and releasing both breath and arrow in one smooth motion that felt like a natural expression of his intent. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the training ground as the warriors gathered around the war club instructor, a man whose arms bore the scars of countless practice sessions. The war clubs lay arranged on a blanket of soft hide, each one a unique example of the weapon maker's art. Some were carved from single pieces of hardwood, their striking ends weighted with carefully placed stones. Others featured separate heads of carved stone lashed to wooden handles with sinew and rawhide. All shared the same deadly purpose: to deliver crushing blows that could end fights decisively while remaining manageable in confined spaces. Ayanna selected a club that felt comfortable in his grip, its weight balanced between the striking head and the wooden handle in a way that allowed for both power and control. The instructor's first lesson was about distance and timing. Unlike spears or arrows, war clubs required fighters to close to arm's length with their opponents, entering the range where death could strike from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychological preparation for this kind of combat was as important as the physical training. The practice sequences began with solo forms, each warrior working through predetermined patterns that taught the basic striking angles and defensive positions. The war club moved in arcs and circles, its weight carrying it through motions that became more natural with repetition. Overhead strikes that could crush skulls, side swipes that could shatter ribs, thrusting motions that could drive opponents back. Each movement was practiced until it flowed naturally from the one before it. When the instructor introduced partner drills, the intensity of training increased dramatically. Working with wooden practice shields, pairs of warriors engaged in controlled combat that tested their ability to attack and defend simultaneously. Ayanna found himself facing Takoda, a friend since childhood whose competitive nature made him an ideal training partner. The crack of war club against wooden shield rang out across the practice ground, punctuated by the instructor's calls for better positioning, quicker recovery, and more aggressive pursuit of openings. These drills revealed aspects of combat psychology that target practice could never teach. When an opponent's weapon was coming directly at your head, even in practice, every instinct screamed for retreat or panic. Learning to stand firm, to trust in shield and footwork while launching counterattacks, required a kind of courage that could only be developed through repeated exposure to simulated danger. As the afternoon progressed, the training shifted from individual weapon skills to the larger arts of tactical awareness and environmental reading. The training master led them to a section of ground that included various types of terrain: open grassland, scattered trees, a low ridgeline, and a marshy area where water collected after rains. This natural classroom would teach them to see the battlefield through experienced eyes, to understand how terrain could be used as an ally or avoided as a danger. The first lesson involved simply standing still and observing. For long minutes, the 20 warriors remained motionless, learning to notice details they had previously overlooked: wind direction and strength, revealed by the movement of grass and leaves, areas where the ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps or firm enough to provide secure footing for rapid movement, lines of sight that could conceal approaching enemies or expose advancing friends, natural choke points where small numbers could hold against larger forces. Communication without sound became the next challenge, as the training master introduced them to the complex language of hand signals that allowed coordinated action in situations where vocal commands would reveal positions to enemies. A closed fist raised above the head meant immediate halt. Fingers pointed in specific directions indicated movement commands. Different numbers of extended fingers conveyed information about enemy numbers and positions. The complexity of the system rivaled spoken language in its precision and clarity. Learning the signals required not just memorization, but development of peripheral vision and situational awareness that allowed warriors to receive and relay commands while maintaining focus on potential threats. Ayanna practiced the hand positions until they became automatic responses, muscle memory that would function even under the stress of actual combat. As shadows grew longer, The training intensified with formation work that tested everything they had learned throughout the day. The shield wall, which had seemed challenging that morning, now became the foundation for more complex tactical movements, advancing while maintaining the wall's integrity, wheeling left or right in response to threats from unexpected directions, opening gaps to allow friendly forces to pass through, then closing them before enemies could exploit the openings. The training master introduced scenarios designed to test their ability to maintain formation discipline under stress, simulated arrow fire that required them to raise shields overhead while maintaining forward momentum, flanking attacks that demanded rapid redeployment without breaking the line's cohesion. Each drill revealed new aspects of tactical thinking, showing how individual skills combined into larger capabilities when properly coordinated. Ayana found his understanding of warfare evolving throughout these exercises. What had seemed like a contest between individual fighters revealed itself as something far more complex, a coordination challenge that required not just personal courage and skill, but also the ability to subsume individual instincts to group necessity. The strongest warrior was worthless if his actions compromised his unit's effectiveness. Victory belonged not to heroes, but to units that functioned with seamless efficiency. The late afternoon mock battles transformed the training ground into something approaching an actual battlefield, complete with the chaos, confusion, and decisions made in a single breath that characterized real combat. The hide-wrapped practice weapons could still inflict bruises, lending an edge of genuine consequence to the proceedings. Ayana found himself part of a defensive formation tasked with protecting a simulated village area marked by wooden stakes, while an equal number of warriors prepared to attack from multiple directions. The first assault came as a coordinated rush from 3 directions simultaneously, testing the defender's ability to maintain formation integrity while redirecting forces to meet multiple threats. Ayana's shield arm ached as he absorbed the impact of padded war clubs and dulled spear points, his muscles burning with the effort of maintaining position while striking back at openings in the attacker's guard. The sound was overwhelming. Shouts of command, the crash of weapons against shields, the grunt of effort and impact as bodies collided in controlled fury. What struck him most powerfully was how quickly individual identity dissolved into group function during intense combat. There was no time for personal fear or hesitation, no opportunity for individual heroics that might compromise unit effectiveness. Survival depended entirely on trusting the warriors on either side, knowing that their shields would be in position when needed. But the day's greatest lesson was still to come. As the mock battles concluded and exhausted warriors gathered for final instruction, the training master prepared to share wisdom that could only be understood after experiencing the intensity of simulated combat, truths about the warrior's path that were meaningless until earned through sweat and determination. As the warriors gathered for the day's final instruction, the training master's tone became serious, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom about the realities of actual combat. The afternoon's simulated fighting had awakened something primal in many of the young men, an excitement about their growing capabilities that needed to be balanced with understanding of responsibility. The master spoke of warriors he had known who had let skill go to their heads, who had sought out conflict rather than accepting it as a last resort. The code of the warrior, he explained, was not about seeking opportunities to use their training, but about developing the capability to protect those who could not protect themselves. Every technique they had learned, every weapon they had mastered, every formation they could execute was ultimately in service of preserving life, not taking it. The greatest warriors in their people's history were remembered not for the enemies they had killed, but for the lives they had saved, the communities they had preserved. The discussion that followed challenged many of the young men's assumptions about what it meant to be a warrior. Stories of famous fighters who had avoided combat whenever possible, who had used their reputations to end conflicts before they began. Examples of battles that had been prevented by displays of readiness rather than fought with weapons. The understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary. Ayana listened with growing comprehension as the master described the warrior's greatest challenge, maintaining humanity while preparing for inhumanity. The training they had undergone was essential for protecting their people, but it also carried the risk of making violence seem like a desirable solution to problems that might be solved through other means. The balance between readiness and restraint, between capability and wisdom, this was the true test of warrior character. As twilight approached and the day's formal training concluded, the warriors gathered around a fire that had been kindled with traditional methods, its flames fed by wood carefully selected for the ceremony that would mark the end of their intensive day of preparation. The Fire Council was an ancient tradition, older than memory, a time when the day's lessons were integrated into larger understanding through discussion and reflection. The training master's words carried special weight in the firelight, his scarred face speaking of lessons learned through experience that no practice session could replicate. He spoke of the responsibility that came with the skills they had developed, the understanding that their training was not about personal achievement, but about service to something larger than themselves. Every technique they had mastered was ultimately a gift to their community, a contribution to the collective security that allowed others to live in peace. Around the circle, each warrior was invited to speak about the day's experiences, to share insights that had emerged through the intensity of training. Ayana found himself talking about the moment during formation fighting when he had stopped thinking of himself as an individual and become part of something larger, when personal identity had dissolved into group function. Others spoke of similar realizations, that courage was not about fearlessness but about acting correctly despite fear, that skill without wisdom was meaningless. The stories shared around the fire that night would become part of the teaching tradition, passed down to future generations as examples of the insights that could emerge through dedicated training and honest reflection. The master spoke of warriors from previous generations who had sat around similar fires, facing similar challenges, and discovering similar truths about the nature of courage and responsibility. As the fire burned lower and full darkness settled over the training ground, the warriors began the night watch rotation that would protect their temporary camp until dawn brought new challenges. The watch system was another aspect of warrior training, teaching vigilance and responsibility while providing opportunities for quiet reflection on the day's intensive experiences. Ayana drew the second watch, which would begin when the stars reached their predetermined positions. Standing watch alone in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of night creatures and the whisper of wind through grass, Ayana reflected on the transformation he felt within himself. The boy who had risen that morning with paint fresh on his face seemed like a different person, someone who had understood warrior training only as an exciting adventure rather than as preparation for responsibilities that could determine the survival of everyone he loved. The weight of his wooden shield, which had felt so heavy during the morning's initial exercises, now seemed like a natural extension of his body. The night sky, unmarked by any light except stars and the thin crescent of moon, reminded him of the world he was being trained to protect. No signal fires from distant settlements, no evidence of the vast network of communities that depended on warriors like himself for security. The darkness that could conceal approaching threats also hid the peaceful villages where children slept safely because young men were willing to spend cold nights standing watch. His watch partner was Dakota, with whom he had practiced war club techniques earlier in the day. They took turns walking the perimeter and sitting by the banked fire, talking quietly about the day's lessons and the training that would continue through the coming weeks. Both young men understood that this intensive day was just the beginning of a longer journey toward the kind of readiness their community required. As his watch period ended and he woke the warrior who would take the final shift before dawn, Ayana settled into his sleeping robes with muscles that ached from unaccustomed exertion, but with a mind that was clearer than it had been since childhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, advanced techniques that built on the foundation established during this first intensive day. The path toward full warrior status stretched ahead like an unmarked trail, demanding dedication and sacrifice that he was only beginning to understand. But tonight, surrounded by young men who had shared the day's trials and discoveries, protected by the watch rotation that connected them to traditions older than anyone's living memory, he slept with the deep satisfaction that comes from giving everything to a worthy cause. The wooden shield that lay within arm's reach was no longer just a piece of carved oak and rawhide, but a symbol of commitment to something that transcended individual existence, the eternal human duty to stand between innocence and harm. In his dreams that night, Ayanna saw generations of warriors who had carried similar shields, faced similar challenges, and made similar commitments to protection and service. They were reminding him that courage was not something that belonged to any single generation, but was instead a gift passed down through time, renewed in each group of young people who accepted the responsibility of standing watch so others could sleep peacefully.